Thank you, Marlon. It's good to be back under this beautiful ceiling and these walls and this vessel of the Sigtuna Stiftelsen, and this vessel of ClimateExistence. As our son, who's 8, said to me last night, ClimateExistence handlar konferensen om att klimatet finns. 12 years ago, I stood on a railway platform in Scotland. In the last days of December, I'd been home in the way that you sometimes go home as a grown-up to the place your parents live now, which might not be the place where you did your growing up. I've been staying with my parents, and in the way that sometimes happens, the most important bit of conversation got saved for the last possible minute. So I'm standing on the platform with my dad, waiting for the train, and I say, "Dad, I'm moving to Sweden." And he says, "Oh, I'm going to a conference in Sweden this summer. It's in a place called Sigtuna." And I say, "Oh, well, that's funny, because Anna, my partner, who I was moving to Sweden to live with, Anna's parents live in Sigtuna. So I know that they say Sigtuna is where Sweden begins. And for me, in a personal sense, that's been very true from the beginning of my life in this country that has been becoming my home over the last 11 and a half years. The conference my dad was coming to was not ClimateExistence. It was the International Bonhoeffer Congress, a gathering that happens every 2 years in different places around the world of people who study the life and work of the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And my dad has forgotten more about Bonhoeffer than I know. But as I've been here over the last day or so, I've found various themes and thoughts from Bonhoeffer echoing in the background of things that we've been saying to each other. It started with Ida and Shashtin's beautiful opening yesterday with their interpretation of the Conference of the Birds. You remember the first of the 7 valleys that the birds pass through is the Valley of Calling. One of the things that Bonhoeffer both wrote about and embodied was what it really means to be called and to answer a calling. And that it doesn't involve a kind of rational balancing of the arguments for and against an action. It takes us back to what Mikael was speaking about yesterday morning, about how our actions come from a deeper and more mysterious source. The response to the call comes from that deep impulse, not from some rational weighing of the arguments for and against. I'm sure there are people in this room who know more about Bonhoeffer than I do, but for those who aren't familiar with him, he was a young priest and theologian in Germany who was among the relatively small number of figures within the church who actively and from early on resisted the Nazification of the German church, insisted that the church should be speaking out against the treatment of the Jews, and attempted to get the international churches to distance themselves from the German church because of its connection to the Nazis. And he was at the center of this church struggle that took place in Germany in the 1930s, and to a large extent failed. And by the time of the Second World War, he, having been a pacifist, became involved in the resistance to Hitler within Germany. And the reason why the International Bonhoeffer Congress in 2012 was happening here in Sigtuna is because this is where he came in 1942. During the war, he managed to come undercover working for the resistance, stayed in the house that's now the tourist bureau on the main street here in Sigtuna, to meet with Bishop Bell from the Church of England, who was staying here at the Stiftelsen, to bring messages from the resistance, to try and open a line of communication with the Allies, to try and contribute to bringing down the Hitler regime and bringing a peaceful end to the war. And again, he failed. He was later arrested for his part within the plot to assassinate Hitler, and he was murdered by the Nazis within the closing days of the Second World War. But there's something about that detail of Sigtuna as a place where that encounter could happen that, for me, in my imagination at least, embodies the best side of the history of Swedish neutrality. The combination of historical and geographic factors that has made Sweden often a place that feels a long way back from the front lines of where history is playing out. And there is a cheap version of neutrality, which is, keeping everybody happy and not getting involved. The costly version of neutrality is creating meeting places where people who might look on the surface like their opponents can have quiet conversations that have a chance but no guarantee of changing the course of events. And so to me, perhaps just because that was how Sigtuna first arrived in my life, it's always embodied that. And not least in a smaller way, there is an echo of that, I think, in the Sigtuna Foundation here and the role of these gatherings that have been very important and very formative for me, these ClimateExistence gatherings and the other meetings that CMS has hosted in these buildings over the years. Because it's rare to come to a space around conversations around climate change where science and art and faith are all represented in a space which is not owned or dominated by one of those actors. And I think that's why the encounters that I've had in these small conferences have been so generative for me over the years. And so to come here this year and bring At Work in the Ruins to the conference feels a bit like bringing the book home. There are a number of threads within the book that quite explicitly root themselves in encounters that I've had in this room in years gone by. 7 years ago, I remember sitting on the stage with Archbishop Antje Jacquelian on one side and David Abram, the great Jewish animist thinker, on the other side, as the pair of them were conjuring with Hebrew etymology to ground us in the elemental, earthly and airly presence of our being in the world. 5 years ago, I had the honor to introduce Vanessa Andreotti on this stage when she came to speak to us about existence beyond the house modernity built. And that was the first time I'd met Vanessa, and that became a very important friendship and collaboration for me that was born out of ClimateExistence. And without Vanessa's book, Hospicing Modernity, there's no way that I would have written At Work in the Ruins. Not least because I literally spent 3 weeks every afternoon in the cupboard under the stairs in the barn at the bottom of our garden, reading aloud every single word of Hospicing Modernity, because Vanessa asked me to voice the audiobook of it, bringing this book, which is born out of the experience of someone who has had such a different life to me, through my body, on my own in a little room, into a microphone. And it was at the end of those 3 weeks, at the end of that ritual of reading Vanessa's book, that I began to write my book. 2 years ago, I wasn't even here. I was meant to be speaking at the last ClimateExistence and had to pull out And even that is actually part of the story of how this book happened. The immediate reason why I had to pull out was very personal and family related, but the larger context of it was that I was reaching a point of crisis. I had got to a place where I was questioning whether it still makes sense to talk about climate change. And I've come back to wonder with you about the places that question took me. And it's in the company of a number of people in this room that I was able to explore it and follow it to the point where it became a book. And along the way, I found myself crossing paths more than once with the work of someone called Stephen Jenkinson. So it feels very appropriate to be having the chance to open today's gathering by speaking about this. And I want to start things off by reading a little bit from one of the chapters where I found myself crossing paths with Stephen's work. It's a chapter called "The Only Prediction I'm Going to Make." The title is a reference to the first lecture I ever gave at CIMUS in 2014 when I was asked to open the academic year. And I stood on stage, rather unusually for me, with a PowerPoint. And I did this whole thing about how I wasn't going to offer any sort of four-cornered quadrant diagrams of future scenarios. There weren't going to be any charts in my talk. I was only going to make one prediction, and I don't think there's anything that any of us can do about it, and it's this. I clicked the button, and on the screen in big letters it said, "We are all going to die." And this chapter is really the point where the book starts to move into the depth, into the existential questions, because one of the things that came home to me as I was writing was a sense that a lot of our talk about climate change is clouded by the difficulty we have in talking about or looking clearly at living with the reality of the smaller personal extinction that is waiting for each of us somewhere down the road. And that in a strange sense, this modern society with all its wonders, whose side effects have brought us to this crisis that we call climate change, is peculiarly ill-equipped to face the reality of where that has brought us, because we are, in Stephen's words, a death-phobic society. We're a society that got so good at solving problems that we forgot that the world is not a problem to be solved. And in the chapter, I talk about the distinction that I first heard from John Michael Greer between a problem and a predicament. A problem has a solution. You can fix it and it goes away and life continues much the way it was before. A predicament can't be fixed or made to go away. It's something that you have to find ways of living with. You can respond to it, but it's going to change you and it's going to change everything. And I think that we often approach climate change as if it's a problem. And then when we find that we can't fix it and make it go away, that feels like the end of everything, because the mentality of the societies we were born into is so oriented to problems and solutions that we've almost forgotten the repertoire of responses that are called for in the face of a predicament. But one of the examples that Greer gives of what is a predicament is mortality. Every now and then we meet someone who thinks that mortality is a problem to be solved. I tell the story in the book of meeting a guy who showed me his membership card of the Cryonics Institute with the set of instructions for what's to be done if you find his recently deceased body. And I shook his hand and I could almost feel the coldness coming back into his living body from this deal that he had tried to do to escape death. But most of us still have a kind of gut-level sense that there's a category error going on there. It's one of these places where, even if we don't like to look at it too hard or think about it or sit with it too closely, we still retain some remnant of a sense that there is a distinction between a problem and a predicament. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from the end of that chapter, from where that line of thought took me. And this is happening in a garden just down the hill here in Sigtuna. 3 years ago. One evening in the first days of 2020, between the headlines of Australia burning and an assassination in the Middle East, my partner sees a story about a meteor shower that's due. Outside, the sky is clear, and I catch sight of one straight away, a bright flash traveling across the sky like a silent firework. So we pull out the sun lounger from my in-laws' conservatory and lie under blankets, staring up. While we wait, my son wants to be told the names of the constellations. He's not yet 5, but he knows there are 2 names for everything, Swedish and English. Even when these are only 2 ways of pronouncing names older than the languages we speak. Orion, Taurus, the Pleiades. The last time I saw my friend, the novelist Alan Garner, he told me there's new research on the resemblance between the Greek constellations and the figures seen in the sky by Aboriginal people in Australia. The similarities are strong enough to hint at common threads of myth leading deep into prehistory, stories carried out of Africa. How does it work when you wish on a falling star? My son wants to know. Does the thing you wish for just pop up out of the ground? His eyes are wide with recent memories of Father Christmas and the cartoons he's been getting to watch on his grandparents' TV. Suddenly I understand why he was so keen on this impromptu astronomic outing. I'm going to wish for a Paw Patrol fire engine, he announces. I don't know how to disentangle myself or my family from this way of being, this web of extraction that surrounds us with objects that seem to pop up magically out of the ground. I don't even know how to frame the question, how to name the work that's called for. It's not a problem, I remind myself, it's a predicament. One thing I know that helps, one piece of the work, is to gather and share the embers of other ways of being, blowing them gently into flame together, knowing how much unfinished history we bring to such encounters. As I listen to those who have more experience than I do of the ways life has been made to work in other times and places, one theme I hear is how much work goes into making a grown-up. It's not something you become by virtue of surviving childhood or sitting out enough years in schoolrooms and lecture theatres. When the time comes, it takes a work of initiation on which much of the life of your community is focused. You have to be cooked in the flames, I've heard it said. And the frame of initiation which your culture builds is the vessel that gives you a chance of coming through the fire. Among the stories and skills acquired in such a process, among the experiences described by those who have gone through it, a common element is some form of ritual death. On the threshold of becoming a grown-up, you're taken through a staged encounter with your own mortality, an encounter which is taken with the utmost seriousness. I'm thinking about this and about the clumsy, risk-filled encounters that bridged this gap as my friends and I stumbled into adulthood. And a thought comes. So that you do not meet your death for the first time when it comes for real. To be a grown-up, it seems to me, is to live alert to consequences, to know the cost of your living. It is hard to be a grown-up in the world that we have made. The cost is almost unbearable. No wonder our culture seems built to keep us distracted, to postpone the encounter with consequences until the last possible moment. If I insist that we have a lot to learn from the ways in which people have made life work in other times and places, this is not to romanticize the lives of others. There is no way back, nor would we want one. The lives of our ancestors were hard in ways we do not like to think about. For this reason, they could not afford the kind of carelessness to which we have been accustomed. Cushioned on millions of years of fossil energy, veiled by the impersonal logic of commodity exchange and the Emerald City magic of the shop window display, the level of detachment from consequences which has been normal, even necessary, for participation in our death-fueled societies of consumption was, until quite recently, the preserve of mad emperors. Our ancestors could not afford this carelessness, and nor, it turns out, can we. Thank you. Now, it can happen. Some of the other writers in the room will know this, that in the last days of writing a book, after months at your desk weaving together the work of years, you stumble on the work of someone who has arrived by other paths at a common standpoint. And it happened to me with this book. Right at the end of the process, I came across the work of an Italian philosopher called Federico Campagna, and in particular, a recent book of his, Prophetic Culture. And when I took Work in the Ruins to England in February to mark its publication, I had the chance to sit down with Federico in London, and I told him what I had heard in his book, which was not exactly how he had put it, but he felt recognized. What I heard was this: sometimes you are born into the end of a world. This is a thing that happens. It has happened before to others in other times and places. The arc of a world, as Federico describes it, is the arc of a story. And there comes a generation, there come generations near the end of that story who are born at the point where there is a lot of that story behind them and not much of it left in front of them. How do you discern that this may be the case, that you may have been born into the ending of the world you were born into? Well, one symptom of it is that the future no longer works. The future in the ordinary sense of it. Because the future in the ordinary sense is the continuation of that arc of the story of the world, the society, the culture that you were born into. And when you're near the end of that arc, it no longer sounds convincing when people attempt to tell you a story which is made by taking a line from somewhere in the recent past through the present and projecting it onwards in a way that is meant to mobilize hope. The politicians still use the language of the future in the same way that they did a generation or two ago, but it no longer seems to work. Worse, we begin to see forms of politics that appeal to the past and that do so in ways that don't offer us any way out of the trouble we're in, but that seem to be capable of mobilizing cultural energy in a way that a politics that directs itself to the future no longer seems capable of doing. These are all symptoms, in Federico's terms, of finding yourself at the end of a story, at the end of a world. So what's worth doing, he asks, if it is your discernment that you were born into the end of the world you were born into? And he has two suggestions. First, he says, you can stop trying to make sense within the logic of the world that is ending. You can stop worrying as much about needing to make sense to the things you're meant to take seriously if you want to be taken seriously within the world you were born into. And secondly, you can seek to make good ruins. Because, as Paul Kingsnorth and I wrote in the Dark Mountain Manifesto, the end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world full stop. We don't know what will be left, but there will be people trying to make life work among the ruins of the failure of the promises that we were sold. And so part of the work of living on that hinge, living in that moment where the awareness is dawning that the future no longer works, the story that we were within is broken in ways that are not going to be cheaply fixed, that are more of a predicament than a problem. The work then can involve attempting to make sure that what is left behind, what is handed on, the broken, unfinished things that are there to be picked up in the times to come include some things that may contribute to the possibility of making worlds worth living in that we cannot imagine yet. And if you want another image for what making good ruins might look like, Matt Osmond, writing for Dark Mountain, drew our attention to the nurse log in the forest, the mother tree that has lived for 1,000 years, and when it dies, in its dying, releases resources to the other creatures, the other things that are growing around it. Part of what making good ruins might look like is looking for where are the dying mother trees within the world of modernity, the world that we were born into, and how do we release the resources that they're holding in ways that can contribute to the possibilities of life in the worlds to come. In what's left of this talk, I want to say a few things about why those of us who get to call ourselves artists have a particular role to play in such a moment at the end of a world. But first, I think it's worth me saying a little more about the trouble with talking about climate change, what it was that I was wrestling with 2 years ago when I didn't come to ClimateExistence. It's a bit like this. Imagine you're on a walk in the forest, and the path you're on comes to a place where it forks. And you can see a long way down both of the forks. You can see that they're leading in very different directions. The good news is there's a signpost. The bad news is that written on both arms of the signpost is the same thing. And it has increasingly felt to me as if that's where we are. That on both arms of the signpost are written taking climate change seriously, but they point in massively different directions because they're founded on different assumptions. And so the risk is that when we gather and we talk about the trouble the world is in within the frame of climate change, we can't see clearly the difference between the paths that lie before us. We can't have that conversation clearly. And the urgency, the understandable urgency that comes from all that we know and all we have good grounds to fear about the depth of the trouble we're in with climate change, means that we don't slow down enough to notice the difference between the paths. Something that brought this into focus for me when I was working on the book was a passage from the anthropologists Marisol de la Cadena and Mario Blazer, from the introduction to a book they edited called A World of Many Worlds. Many of the voices in that book are coming from and working in Latin America, often in indigenous contexts. And in the introduction, de la Cadena and Blazer say, this conversation about the Anthropocene that starts in places like Stockholm and Berlin and London and New York and San Francisco, heard from elsewhere, it sounds a lot like the world of the powerful becoming sensitive to the plausibility of its own destruction in a way that may compare with the threat imposed on worlds sentenced to disappearance in the name of the common goods of progress, civilization, development, and liberal inclusion. People who look a lot like most of us in this room went around the world for 500 years, ending so many other people's worlds and calling it progress. And now, belatedly, not least in the form of climate change, it dawns on our awareness that our world too could end. And that awareness can go one of two ways. One possibility is it becomes the point at which we can hear at last what others have been trying to tell us for a long time about the shadow side of modernity, about the things that were missing from our stories of progress and development, about all of the ruins that modernity was creating all along. Mikhail asked me last night at dinner, what are the ruins that you're talking about at work in the ruins? And I was thinking about that some more. later in the evening, and I thought, it's both the ruins of modernity. It's the place we find ourselves when the promises modernity made can no longer be kept, and the ruins that modernity was creating all along, most of which were hidden from view from those of us who meet in rooms like this. So there is a possibility that this newfound sense that our world too could end brings us into an encounter that isn't shaped by the assumption that we live closer to the future and everyone else is living in our past, like Hans Rosling used to tell us. That we have things to learn from those who have experienced modernity not as a thing they did, but a thing that was done to them. Those who've been on the receiving end of processes that were called modernization, where that was often a euphemism for the destruction of their cultures and ways of living and the conditions of viability of their societies. Or this newfound sense of precarity can become the renewed legitimacy and urgency for the same stories of progress, civilization, and development, just when they seemed to have run out of moral authority. And this is the danger. And I mean, this is very literal. When I met Vandana Shiva in Stockholm in January, she said, look, I had a meeting with one of the key people who's one of the architects of this net zero approach that is now the frame in which we're all meant to talk about what needs to be done. And he said, we've got the plumbing now, all we need is to plug the land into it. And Vandana said, no, you do not get to do this. Within a lifetime of the end of the British Empire in India, you do not get to come back and take our land all over again, this time in order to compensate for the climate emissions of Europe and North America. But the trouble is that, it's all being done, or it's mostly being done by good people with good intentions. Because these approaches, these responses are the only ones that make sense within the logic of modernity. And unless we are willing to contemplate the possibility that our world is coming to an end, and in particular, as long as we go on telling the story of what is at stake here, as if the whole of human history, even the whole of biological evolution, has been pointing to the achievements of the ways that some of us have been getting to live around here lately, and we must at all costs try and make that sustainable. Unless we can imagine, or unless we can create the space to sit with how unimaginable it is that our world is coming to an end, then the only responses that make sense, the only responses that seem to be available, are ones that end up repeating these patterns of colonization, these patterns of exploitation. And to say this can sound a lot like giving up. Part of what I want to do is to say that we can hold open spaces, that contexts like the strange spaces of meeting and encounter that can happen here in Sigtuna can help us hold open the space for the possibility that that's not quite true. That's not quite, the end of this story is not the end of stories worth telling. Isabella said something important yesterday when I asked that question about growth. You said that, sometimes when people from the Green Movement talk about growth, we talk very lightly about the idea of a world after growth. And it's true, it's very easy for us to imagine that it's just about Amazon and Walmart and all the aspects of capitalism that we don't like. But actually, it's our whole social model that is dependent on and woven in with the assumption of continued economic growth year by year. And there is no easy or obvious way of disentangling it. Just start with pensions. And one of the most startling things is to actually look at how much of the world's stock markets are owned by the big pension companies. As somebody put it to me recently, the way that the world works right now is that people of working age are working in order to generate profits to pay for the retirements of the people who are currently retired, even while many of those of working age are not convinced that there will be any such retirement when it comes to us. We're not going to be going on 6 foreign holidays a year like lots of middle-class Swedish pensioners are today. But the way that our world system is held together, all of us who are working are contributing to the profits which are paying the pensions of this generation who have lived a more convincing experience in the Western middle classes of progress as a realized thing than any generation before or after them are going to. And it's not just that, it's all of the social infrastructure by which on which we are dependent in a world that has been dominated by the market and the state. Now, saying these things does not mean that we get off the hook of what the analysis that Jason Hickel and Georgios Kallis did of the promises of green growth is telling us, which is that there is no evidence that we can do this. But I think it's important to be reminded of quite how costly what we're suggesting is when we question growth. And this takes me back to Bonhoeffer again, because one of the things that he was saying in the 1930s in the church in Germany, he was saying, the church is offering people cheap grace. Grace that costs nothing. You don't have to change. You are, by virtue of being part of the German people in the German church, you have God's grace. And Bonhoeffer said it's not like that at all. Grace is costly. It's like the Rilke poem, you must change your life. The thing that we're pointing to when we use this strange language of grace and the other religious terms that some of us might use is something that leaves you changed, that makes you a different person, that sets your life on a different course. And I think it's really important in our conversations to notice the difference between the cheap and the costly in the ways that we speak. So I had a reminder yesterday from Isabella about the costliness of questioning growth and the importance of not talking in a way that cheapens that or makes it sound less startling than it really is as a proposition. And I think we had another reminder yesterday as well, because you'll find on stages like this, in rooms like this, at events like this today, you won't find anyone on the stage who isn't quick to speak about how much we have to learn from the wisdom of indigenous peoples. We had a reminder last night of the cost of that, because my Brit came and spoke to us and showed us the films about the reality of what the green transition means for the Sami people, the industrialization of the landscape of Sapmi. And so in the same way, I think that if we speak one moment about learning from the wisdom of indigenous peoples and the next moment about the green transition and good growth and so on, then that to me also is avoiding the costliness of what's really at stake if we're going to finally listen to the things that people have been trying to tell us for generations from our indigenous brothers and sisters, not least in this country, or in this territory that we call Sweden. So, this other path that I'm suggesting is there. It does strain at the limit of the imagination. We don't get to fast forward, to rush on beyond the end of the world we were born into some beautiful, fresh, new world on the far side of it. We have to live through the strains and the mess and the trying to do the best we can under the circumstances we find ourselves in. We have to live with one foot in each world, the world that is ending and the unknown world that lies ahead. And I think this is, I always say this when I'm asked to speak to politicians, that I do not envy anyone who is working in politics in a moment like this, because it is the job of a politician to make sense, to offer propositions that make sense within the logic of the world that we are currently still living within the logic that all of the journalists and all of the other parties are speaking from within. And actually, I think it's worse than this. I think we've been living now for some time with two parallel things going on, which we have a politics that is still trying to make sense in that way, and we have an anti-politics of figures who revel in not needing to make sense and who have been making a lot of hay, exploiting the confusions, exploiting the strangeness of times like these. I do believe that these two modes don't exhaust the political possibilities of a time like this, but I think that the other kinds of political work that are called for here don't look like an alternative platform that I could suggest to any political party to stand on for election to the Swedish Parliament or the European Parliament. Ivan Illich, who was incredibly formative for my work, in the later years of his life used to say, I think that the limits of political possibility today is the number of people who can sit around a table and share a meal together. It sounds very pessimistic the first time you hear it. But there can be many tables and we don't all have to sit at the same table at each meal. And I don't know whether it's the limit, but I do think the starting point of a politics beyond the end of the world as we know it lies closer to the kinds of conversations that we can convene around our kitchen tables than the level at which the necessary work of doing today's politics within the existing systems takes place. A phrase that I heard from people in the Bonhoeffer circle is they spoke about the weak centers of resistance. The importance of the weak centers of resistance, the pockets that look too small to be taken seriously by the existing order, and that was part of how the resistance that Bonhoeffer was part of was able to happen, and a lot of that was happening around people's kitchen tables. But I think this is also where artists come in, so this is where I want to sort of land the talk today. As some of you know, I spent a couple of years in a strange role as leader of artistic development for Riksteatern, Sweden's national theatre. And I was invited in there precisely because Måns Lagerlöf, who was the artistic director at that time, was deeply troubled about climate change, and he'd found the Dark Mountain Manifesto was one of the few things that made sense to him. And I was known in the work that I did there for saying, I think we have to gently decline the usual invitation that comes to us as artists when we're invited to respond to something like climate change. Because the usual invitation, however it's worded, boils down to being a communications tool, helping to deliver the message or raise consciousness, be a sort of transmission mechanism between the science, the knowledge about climate change, and everyone else. And that's not what art is or what it's good for. It's not what we know how to do as artists. As Anders Duus, the Swedish playwright, put it to me, our job is to complicate matters, to bring in the bits that are being left out, not to simplify it in the way that an advertising agency or a PR department is going to do for you. So art isn't a communications tool, but nor can we make art as if we didn't know that the world was on fire, because that's to have a lie in the middle of our work. And so in those 2 years, a lot of the questions that we were asking in the spaces I convened were, what else can art do in times like these? And one of the answers that we came to was to notice that artists tend to be the people with the greatest tolerance for ambiguity, the ones who can stay longest in the tension without needing to resolve it into a simple black and white binary, or the ones who, if you offer them a question with two answers, will find a third answer that you haven't thought of. And that might be part of what's needed in times like these. Lewis Hyde, in his remarkable book, Trickster Makes This World, talks about the trickster archetype in the mythologies of different cultures, and the way in which the figure of the artist in modernity has embodied something of what the mythic role of the trickster is like. And there's a point that he doesn't necessarily draw out in the book, but that came home to me. When he's looking at these different mythologies, he notices how in particular historical moments, the trickster figure within a mythology, within a culture, takes on an unusual importance. Under ordinary circumstances, the trickster figure tends to be a low-status figure within the hierarchy, a source of entertainment or a nuisance, a kind of childlike character, compared to the high gods that embody the different aspects of the existing order. But in a moment when the existing order cannot hold, when that world is coming to an end, the high gods have no moves left because they embody that order. And it's trickster who can make a joke out of it, or find the gap, find the thing that's hidden within the description of reality that that culture has been steering by. And I think there's a particular sense in which this is true of the artist at the end of modernity. Because within the world of modernity, the artist and the artistic space has been the one zone that isn't required to make sense. You know, the rationalization of so many aspects of society has gone on, and then we've had this sort of native reservation of culture. You know, culture used to be what anthropologists study, everything, a whole way of living and being in the world. And in modernity, we put it in this little box and put a capital C on it. And it's the culture section of the newspaper. But within that box, those of us who get to call ourselves artists experience this kind of precarious privilege of not fully having to justify our work by making sense to the economic rationality that governs the lives of so many other people around us. And I want to say that there is a tactical importance to this that only comes into view if we take seriously the proposition that we're living at the end of the world of modernity, which is, you know, if you want to create portals, if you want to create vessels, projects, small institutions that have one door that opens into the world that is coming to an end and another door onto, you know, whatever it is that lies on the far side, I think the only way you can get that funded is to call it art. Because the only way to fund something that doesn't make sense according to the logic of the world that is ending is to call it art, to call it culture. And so this is kind of, you know, a call to those of us who get the privilege of working under that title to look for the ways in which this is already happening and the ways in which we can make it happen, the ways we can build strange doors, kind of Narnia-like thresholds between worlds by using this precarious privilege that we're granted by the logic of the world that is ending. And there is a history to this. You know, art inherited a role from religion on the journey into modernity. Because from, let's say, the 1690s, there was a strong move in the places where modernity was being born from, places like London and Paris, to turn religion into something that made sense. Instead of being, you know, a vessel with all of its complexities that held myth and mystery and indirect ways of knowing things that lie beyond the threshold of direct knowledge, you start to get pamphlets in London in the 1690s with titles like Religion Not Mysterious and A Reasonable Christianity. And within a couple of generations, you get something else that happens, which is you get a kind of inflated high language starts to be used about art and artists. And I think this is because artists become the sort of the custodians. You know, there are no holy fools left within the religious landscape of the West in modernity, and so the artists are the ones who get to be the holy fools. But without any common framework, without anything that weaves them clearly into the fabric of the wider society in the way that religion had provided at its best, a common framework between the holy fool and the everyday. And the danger all along the way was that, you know, what resulted was that artists were kind of running things off the battery of the ego rather than tapping into the metaphysical mains, or had no language in which they could explain the metaphysical roots of their work that was comprehensible to those around them within our societies. And it got worse because in the 20th century, a lot of art got sort of hollowed out in service of ideas and ideology, or descended into a kind of clever nihilism, a kind of game playing over the abyss of meaninglessness. And one of the sources of hope that I have is that over the last 10 years, I've met more and more people who are working at the edges of the arts and religion and science, who are ready to say we don't have all of what's needed, but if we sit down together, we can figure out how to create the kinds of spaces in which the things that can't be measured, the things that haven't been valued within modernity, in which we can be hospitable to them, in which we can begin to relearn some of the skills that we're going to need as we lie ahead. So that is my invitation to those who want to try and explore with me and Anna and the work that we do with a school called Home and with many other pockets where this is going on. What we need to try and create are small institutions that are capable of having one foot in the world that is ending without having to make sense according to the logic of that world, where we can be recovering the capacity to attend to each other, to places and creatures, getting involved with land and food, and making culture around our involvement with land and food, because frankly, until very, very recently, everywhere, the only way that human culture was ever made was in ways that were deeply entangled with land and food, the shared meal, the rhythms of the year. And we're going to be called back to that. It's going to involve practices of being human together, remembering how to be human together, building relationships, getting to know our neighbours, including the ones who vote for parties that no one in this room would ever think of voting for. And that is unimaginable at the level at which our national and international debates take place. But it becomes strangely imaginable in the everyday of neighbourhood, of having to learn how to make life work. And part of getting to know your neighbours is building those relationships before the emergency comes, so that you already know the names and faces and have some shared history with the people who are going to be the only ones who are there for each other as systems that we've taken for granted become less reliable than they have been. And in the international network that we run around our school, we already talk to people for whom this is lived reality today in many countries in the world. And it's really interesting hearing the dialogue backwards and forwards between people in countries that would be marked as less developed on the maps of modernity and highly developed countries, because part of what comes into view is the comparative helplessness that is part of the legacy of the modernity that we have taken such pride in. The lack of skills, the lack of connection, the sense that on this end of modernity, we're kind of in a remedial class, learning how to be human together again. And sometimes just to recognize that, to go, yeah, this isn't the most advanced group of humans that has ever lived. This is remedial class for humans who've forgotten how to be human together, because for a short while, we could be so dependent on oil and colonialism that we didn't need to practice the skills of being human together around here. So that's my invitation to you, and I know that it's fragile and it doesn't look anything like a plan or a policy platform, and I'm not saying for a moment that there is something here that if only everyone would listen to me and read my book, then we could fix it all. That's exactly well, I don't think anyone at the end of this talk is going to be under the illusion that that's what they're going to find in the book, but just to underline it. But I think that there are strange sources of hope there. And one of the people who inspired me deeply and who I write about in the book is Gustavo Esteva, who turned down a cabinet position in the Mexican government in 1976 after having been a senior civil servant for a number of years in Mexico, running programs that were controlling the prices of basic commodities across rural Mexico. And he said, I couldn't explain to anyone why I was walking away when I left. But I knew that even with the people I really trusted, the best people in the rooms, there was a gap between our schemes and plans and what the people wanted. And he went and worked in the barrios in Mexico City. And he was working there, you can read about this in Rebecca Solnit's book, the name of which is escaping me at the moment. It's the one about the post-disaster utopias. But she tells the story of how the projects that Gustavo and his friends were part of in the barrios, working with landless indigenous peasants arriving in the poorest quarters of Mexico City. For years, the government were trying to make what they were doing illegal because they were doing things like creating compost toilets, and compost toilets are primitive, whereas a developed society should have water pipes carrying its shit and pee away from people's homes. And then the Mexico City earthquake in the mid-80s hit and wiped out the entire sewerage system for half of a city of 20 million people. And the only people with answers for how you could deal with all of the shit were these guys who a week earlier the government had been trying to make illegal because they were primitive, wanting people to deal with their own shit. So we don't know how the story ends. One of the dangers of the power of the logics of modernity and the things that we've learned how to make sense within is that when we can no longer believe in their promises, it feels like we're pitched into a sort of black certainty about the end of the story. You see this around deep adaptation, for example, and some of the other movements that have come from people who've been very close to centers of national and international institutions and reached a point where they can no longer believe in the promises those institutions make. If I have more hope than that, it's because I spend more time with people like Gustavo and his successors who are finding ways to make life work under circumstances that don't fit with the logics of modernity and development. And I think if things are going to turn out less badly than we often fear in the times ahead, then this kind of work is going to be one of the things that contributes to it. So thank you for listening. That's been a long talk, but